Thank you for that overkind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be in Brisbane. You know, I was conceived in Queensland. The end of the war, the fighter pilot and WAF girl from the up in Magnetic Island, I seem to have been told. So it's great to be back. As part of your Festival of Ideas, a festival is a celebration. And the idea that I want to celebrate today is an idea whose time has come in every advanced democracy in the world, and even in Victoria. But not in Queensland or indeed in Australia at a federal level. It's the idea that politicians and governments and their agents, the public servants, police, officials of all kinds, should have the power over what they can do to people limited by a Bill of Rights or Charter of Rights. Now, a lot of politicians don't like this idea. They're democratically elected, and they don't think it's right that their powers should be in any way curbed by unelected judges. Well, I'm going to discuss that objection after I tell you about the human rights story, how human rights should be viewed as fundamental to any real democracy. Well, you've just had an election here in Queensland, of course, and it's Sunday. I guess most of your newly elected politicians are out and about thanking those who voted for them, putting flowers on graves in cemeteries in certain electorates. Politicians don't like a Bill of Rights because they claim they can do anything, and here in Queensland, if that includes an ability to raise the dead, well and good. It sort of gives a precise meaning to the phrase absentee vote. But I have to say that your ministry does seem to be full of ministers of very great integrity, because the only criticism that the newspaper could make of them this morning is that the Minister of Transport has lost a few demerit points for speeding. Now, if you think about it in the context of Queensland history, that's incredibly reassuring. It proves that she isn't corrupt. I'm old enough to remember Russ Hintz, the Minister of Police, when a young and remarkably naive copper pulled him over and was about to book him for speeding. Russ got out of the car, took a map of Queensland and spread it on the bonnet and said, "Now listen, son, I'm the Minister of Police. Where would you like to be posted?" So the very fact that Queensland ministers are now being done for speeding is reassuring. Russ was, of course, quite a character. He was at one point the Minister of Mines, and a journalist discovered that he also owned some quarries. And it put it to him that this was a conflict of interest. And quick as a flash, he said, no, it's not a conflict of interest, it's a convergence of interests. A good defense for Mr. Nuttall, perhaps. He's taking his cut, allegedly, or his open cut. Right. But as for judges, they're not really as interesting as politicians, thank goodness. They're not elected precisely so they can be beholden to no one, so they can be impartial, so they can be independent in deciding between the citizen and the state. In all the hundreds, all the thousands of disputes that arise between individuals and sometimes bloody-minded bureaucrats, you need an umpire who is unbiased, and judges fulfill that role. And I'll be arguing that the Charter gives them not so much the power, but the principle to make better decisions, to make good decisions and fairer decisions than they can now. But they are, on the whole, unadventurous, somewhat conservative, fairly decent people. Marcus Einfeld has had so much publicity recently, I suspect, because he's the exception that proves the rule. He's gone from national treasure to buried treasure. But according to the press, he's been asking rather forlornly for a masseuse. Well, let any federal politician express a desire for a masseuse, and I'm sure the Chinese government will be all too willing to oblige. In Shanghai, Beijing, People's Pleasure Palace of your choice, you never find the Chinese Minister of Propaganda flying to Canberra for a secret discussion with the Chief Justice, do you? They've spent many years grooming Australian politicians, but there's no way that they'll groom Australian judges, especially if they have the intellectual background that a Bill of Rights provides. So let me turn to the human rights story and give you a thumbnail sketch of what human rights, the idea of human rights, how it came into being, what it means today. When we think of human rights, we think Magna Carta. Well, Magna Carta was back in 1215. It was a pretty squalid deal between the barons and the king at the time, but it was reinvented in the great struggle between Parliament and the king in the 17th century. It was a jurist called Edward Coke who devised the first modern-ish Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Right, which Parliament tried to assert against the Stuart absolutism in 1628. Well, Charles I had a quick answer to that. He abolished Parliament. And he abolished it for 12 years. And in the course of those years where the Puritans, whose leaders he tortured, emigrated, 30,000 of them, to start America, he really made war on the idea of popular monarchy. He believed he was divinely ordained, many people did, and that his role was to control government absolutely, an absolute monarch. And torture through his Star Chamber was something that was done to his enemies. And in 1641, when Parliament, in the great civil war that was fought in England, more casualties indeed than on the Somme, the first thing that Parliament did when it broke with the king was to abolish the Star Chamber and abolish torture. Since 1641, it's been the great boast, I think, of the common law that Arthur Phillip brought to this country and we inherited, that torture was outlawed. Torture thereafter was something that was done by the French. And they did it for 200 years in Europe. It was part of a legal process that, if you've seen Tosca, you remember in the second act, the judge comes in to organize the torture. It was part of the legal process. And that's one of the great first rights that was established when Parliament fought that war to establish its own right of sovereignty, was the abolition of torture, the right of the people to not to be taxed without representation. There were other rights as well that started. The most important, in the long run perhaps, was the independence of the judiciary. In 1608, King James had called the Chief Justice and said to him that it was improper ever for a judge to find against the king because the king appointed the judges. And the Chief Justice Coke said, well, actually, sir, the law is the golden measure of your monarchy. It protects you as well as everyone else. And the king came at him and started to beat him up. And the Chief Justice groveled at the king's feet and begged an apology. That was a time when the judges were not independent. They had their tenure only at the say-so of the king. They could be sacked at the government's pleasure, in other words. But in 15th of January 1642, Parliament, newly empowered, decided that judges would be independent, subject to the power of dismissal if they misconduct themselves. So here we are starting to get, and that was the beginning of the independent and impartial judge. There were other rights that started to come out once the divinely ordained absolute king fell from the pedestal, was beaten in war, and in the event executed. The right to free speech, Milton in Areopagitica, the censorship of the press is like the gallant man who seeks to keep out the crows by shutting his park gate. The liberty of speech starts to become very important. So too does religious freedom. The battles were fought very often for the right to pray without bishops, for the right to go to heaven in their own way. Cromwell let back the Jews into England in 1654, a very important moment in religious toleration. So we are starting, even at this crucible stage, the minute that the tyranny of the absolute monarch is overthrown, we start to get these ideas of rights. They weren't called human rights. In the Putney debates in 1647, the first idea of universal suffrage, the poorest he, said the Leveller leader, is entitled to a vote as much as the greatest he. They weren't talking about the poorest she in those days, but it was the beginning of the idea of universal suffrage. So really we owe this democratic tradition not to the slave-owning societies of Athens and Greece, not to the pleasant gardens of the French philosophers, not to, indeed, the slave owners who were the founders of American democracy. We owe it to those blood-stained soldiers who, when they overthrew the tyranny, were imbued with these ideas. And in 1689, the Bill of Rights, it's actually part of Australian law, or no one thinks of it very much, made free speech in Parliament a right. Politicians have their own rights from the Bill of Rights of 1689. No cruel or unusual punishments shall be inflicted, no excessive bail, thanks to the Bill of Rights. Well, of course, when we think of rights, we think of the American Declaration of Independence, we think of the French Revolution and the rights of man. And it was these documents coming a century and a half later are very important, obviously, in their time. There's a marvelous story of Jefferson, who did the first draft of the American Declaration, coming and reading it to Ben Franklin. "We hold these truths," he said, "to be sacred and inviolable." "Bit preachy," said Ben Franklin, and looked at "These truths are self-evident, are they not, Mr. Jefferson?" So they struck out sacred and inviolable and inserted "These truths are self-evident, that all men are created equal," and so forth. But the problem with the French Declaration, and indeed with the American Declaration, is that they were based on the idea of natural rights, rights that were somehow from God, inalienable, clung to each individual like a shadow. Well, spool on a few years, Jeremy Bentham, on the liberal side, says this is nonsense, nonsense on stilts. And Karl Marx, a few years later, said, this doesn't make sense. These are bourgeois rights. So the idea of human rights is really lost throughout the 19th century. There is nothing that is developed in terms of rights except, of course, the abolition of slavery. I'll tell you a little story about this time in 1787. In a small office in the English Admiralty, as he was waiting for 11 ships to be provisioned, because he refused to sail until they were provisioned, Arthur Phillip, son of a Jewish dancing master from Leipzig, refused to sail and wrote what he said would be the first law for this new country. Only he thought that he was founding a nation. And he said, the first law, because there can be no slavery in a free country. There shall be no slavery in this country. And that was the first law of Australia. It wasn't called Australia at the time. Matthew Flinders came up with that some years later. But it is remarkable that 20 years before slavery was abolished, 100 years before, at the Congress of Berlin, the main nations agreed to abolish slavery, we here were founded this open prison that turned remarkably into a great country. Was its first law was there shall be no slavery in this country. And of course, there are other great events that happened in so far away no one noticed them. The fight of the emancipists against the free settlers, the fight for trial by jury. No one, let alone the martinets who ran Sydney, wanted trial by jury, particularly when the jury would include emancipists with a criminal record as a snapper-up of ill-considered trifles. But the jury was terribly important because, of course, most of Australia was begun because of the mercy of juries. There was, in those terrible days in Britain, you were executed, you were hung if you stole more than 40 shillings, and it was the jury who decided how much had been stolen. And it's remarkable if you look at the records at the Old Bailey to see just how many people had their vast load of stolen goods reckoned to cost only 39 shillings, because that was the bargain that the jury made. They convicted, but they brought in a sentence not of death, but of transportation, and that is why, after we lost the American colonies, they had to find another open prison. And it was part of the development of this country from open prison to modern democracy, that the right to jury trial, the right to vote, eventually the right to a free, secular primary and partly secondary education, the rights that were won by trade unionists late in that century, the right of the 40-hour week, the minimum wage, the 35-hour week from Broken Hill for being in dangerous jobs, even the smoko, old-fashioned now to think of it, but a great breakthrough for labour, the right of labour to have that relaxation period. All these we can be very proud of, but in the world, very little was happening to human rights. In fact, nothing was happening to human rights because it wasn't a concept that was ever discussed, even as Hitler was extinguishing them in Europe. The League of Nations, the Permanent Court of International Justice, no one spoke of human rights. Of course, there had been a time back in 1915 with the Armenian massacres when the crime against humanity was first spoken of in relation to that, what we now call, if we're not Turkish, genocide. It was indeed a genocide. It was a terrible crime, but it was not punished. After the war at Versailles, there was no punishment, and there was that extraordinary moment when Hitler is recorded on the Polish border urging his generals to show no mercy. He said, "Who now remembers the Armenians?" There was no sense of universal human rights. There was no concept. And it was the great idea of a group of English writers, middle-class socialists, led by H.G. Wells and including J.B. Priestley, who drafted the first Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a Penguin special. A group of writers, A.A. Milne would motor up from Pooh Corner to add his contribution to the draft. And in 1939, as the lights were going out in Europe, they produced this document, H.G. Wells on the Bill of Rights. It was a Penguin special. It was translated into 30 languages. It seemed to offer some hope against the impending Holocaust. And in fact, the British Foreign Office thought that it was so persuasive that they had it translated into German, and they dropped it on the Nazi tanks as they were sweeping across France. They didn't stop to read it, of course, but one person who did was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was a friend of H.G. Wells, and it inspired his For Freedom speech. What we're fighting for, he said shortly after Pearl Harbor, was freedom of speech and religion, freedom from want and from fear. And then the Atlantic Charter, January 1942, Australia, one of the first to sign, did promise human rights in our and in other lands as the war aim, the overwhelming war aim. Well, the war ended, and it ended with a great debate between Churchill originally and the Americans, Truman, who had replaced Roosevelt, over what should be done to the Nazi criminals, because at that time there was no international criminal law. You could mass murder your own people quite readily without having any retribution. And Churchill had a very clear view. He drew up a list of 75 top Nazis, and they were to be given on arrest 6 hours to say their prayers, and then they were to be machine gunned. No trial. Truman said, "This is wrong. I wouldn't sit well on the American conscience or be remembered by our children with pride. We must give them the fairest trial that the times and the horrors will allow." So there was a complete loggerheads, a complete standoff over whether Nuremberg should be held at all, the trials. And of course the deadlock was broken by the third ally, Joe Stalin, who loved show trials, as long as everyone got shot in the end. And so, that unhappy or unfortunate coincidence, we got the trial at Nuremberg. We got, for the first time, and it's laid down an extraordinary law of human rights, that those who breach human rights, no matter how high they be, political or military leaders, have no immunity from crimes against humanity. And that was the legendary trial at Nuremberg established that. And the transcripts of that trial went to Eleanor Roosevelt's committee. Now, I want to say a word about the Human Rights Committee in 1946. It came in after the Paris Peace Conference. And you know, the most striking voice for human rights at the Paris Peace Conference was the Australian delegation. It was led by Dr. H.V. Evatt, an extraordinary figure. I mean, we think of Gallipoli as the time Australia was put on the map. It wasn't, of course. Several of my great cousins were killed in Sniper's Alley, and I don't want to minimize that. But in fact, when you look at Australia's emergence as an individual voice, the first time was the ill-tuned voice of Doc Evatt rising at the Paris Peace Conference to insist on a binding convention of human rights. He wanted an international criminal court with the power to jail heads of state. He wanted a lot of what we are finally getting today. Doc Evatt put before the Paris Peace Conference, and it got Australia a seat on the Human Rights Committee and on Eleanor Roosevelt's committee that was drafting the Universal Declaration. And Australia played a terribly important part. I've actually gone and read the transcripts of that event, and there the Australian delegation, led not by Evatt, who was back in Canberra, no one took much notice of what he was doing, but what he was doing was cabling every night, relentless cables to his delegates to insist that that there was no reference to trade unions in the first draft of the Universal Declaration. Thanks to Australia, the right to belong to a trade union was inserted. Economic and social rights, the right to health and well-being, the right to a modicum of education, and so forth. Australia put them in to the Universal Declaration. Britain was opposed. Eleanor Roosevelt was very wishy-washy and was against, until an Australian delegate, Colonel Hodgson, leant across the table to Eleanor Roosevelt and said, "Listen, love, your husband's third freedom was freedom from want." And Eleanor Roosevelt conceded, and we got economic and social rights. It's a remarkable story of Australia's contribution to the Universal Declaration, a declaration that says, of course, that human rights should be not only acknowledged on a universal level and an international level, but should be part of every nation's law. And, of course, just as we're slowly realizing Doc Everett's dream of a global community based on the rule of law, we should remember the Australian role in that extraordinary triptych that was established in December 1948. The Universal Declaration, the Genocide Convention, which requires states to go to war if necessary and to put on trial those accused of genocide, and a couple of months later, the Geneva Conventions for the proper treatment of prisoners of war, still of very great importance. It was Guantanamo Bay has been such a disaster precisely because the Bush administration ignored the Geneva Conventions, said they didn't apply, said they were obsolete. That was the word that was used. Well, of course, you can find parts of the convention that are obsolete. I had to draft some prison rules for a prison in Sierra Leone, and I modeled them on the Geneva Convention, and I found all these rules that date from 1948. The greatest right the prisoners have under the Geneva Convention is the right to smoke. It is certainly not something they had in my prison. But it was, so in those, and musical instruments, yes, it was hilarious to see the presidential spokesman saying that we're not going to have the Geneva Conventions in Guantanamo. The American taxpayer isn't going to pay for musical instruments for the Taliban, quite overlooking the fact that that clause is in the Geneva Conventions because of the important role of music in the ghettos of Terezin and in the concentration camps for Jewish prisoners, but of course also ignoring the fact that the Taliban hate music and ban it, wouldn't have it there if they wanted it. So the damage that has been done through turning back on the Geneva Conventions is massive. But we had, by 1948, the basic laws